Somewhere beneath the black waters of a small, almost perfectly circular lake high in the Colombian Andes, there is gold. Real gold, not legend, not metaphor, not poetry. Actual pieces of work tumbega, the ancient alloy of gold and copper that the Muisca people fashioned into shapes of men and animals and gods, lying undisturbed in the cold silt for more than 400 years. That gold is there. We know it. Archaeologists know it. And yet, after 5 centuries of frenzied searching, after bucket chains of indigenous laborers and dynamited mountainsides and British steam pumps and multinational companies and half-mad conquistadors and poets and philosophers and a sitting English knight who lost his head over it, the gold remains exactly where it was placed, exactly where it was meant to stay, given to the water, given to the divine. This is the story of El Dorado, and if there is one thing this story teaches us, it is that the most powerful myths in human history are almost never made from nothing. They are made from misunderstanding, from desire, from the terrifying distance between what a thing actually is and what a desperate, hungry, dreaming mind is convinced it must be. If this kind of history is something you enjoy, the kind that reaches into the deep past and pulls out something that still has weight and meaning today, then consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like. New stories arrive regularly, and each one is chosen because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Now, find a comfortable position, let your breathing settle, and let this story come to you. To understand El Dorado, we have to begin not with Spanish ships or maps drawn with shaking hands in candlelit rooms. We have to begin with a plateau. A high, cool, improbable plateau in the eastern Cordillera of the Colombian Andes, sitting at roughly 2,500 meters above sea level, nearly 9,000 feet in the air, where the air is thin and the light has a particular quality that makes everything look slightly unreal. This plateau, known today as the Altiplano Cundiboyacense, was home to one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas, a civilization that the Spanish would ultimately destroy and then partially recreate as a legend that would outlast them. The Muisca people, also called the Chibcha, were not a single tribe with a single king. They were a confederation, a loose but functional alliance of independent chiefdoms spread across an area of approximately 25,000 square kilometers. At the heart of this confederation were 2 great political centers. In the south, ruling from the city of Bacata, the place that would later become Bogota, sat the Zipa, the supreme chief of the southern territories. In the north, ruling from Hunza, the future site of Tunja, sat the Zac. These 2 powers were not always at peace with each other, but they shared a language, a cosmology, and a culture that was, by any meaningful measure, comparable in sophistication to the Aztec, Maya, and Inca civilizations to which their civilization is almost never compared. The Muisca occupied their highland territory through migrations that modern archaeology dates back to roughly 1270 BCE, with a second significant wave of settlement between about 800 and 500 BCE. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Muisca civilization had been flourishing on that plateau for the better part of a millennium in its developed form, and had accumulated centuries of agricultural technique, religious practice, trade relationships, and artistic tradition. What did daily life look like for the Muisca? Far more complex than the Spanish would ever care to understand. Muisca society was organized around extended family clans, and while leadership was primarily male, inheritance passed through the maternal line, a detail that fascinated and confused Spanish administrators, accustomed to their own patrilineal systems of inheritance. The Muisca farmed the high plateau with sophisticated methods, growing maize, potatoes, quinoa, and other Andean staples. They were skilled weavers, producing textiles of great quality and complexity. They mined emeralds from the Boyaca region, some of the finest in the world, a resource that the Spanish would later covet just as intensely as gold. And they were master producers and traders of salt, extracted from the salt mines of Zipaquira and Nemocon, which they traded throughout a wide network of neighboring peoples. But gold. Gold is the thing we need to talk about because the Muisca relationship with gold was nothing like what the Spanish imagined it to be. Ironically, the Muisca territory itself was not particularly rich in gold ore. They did not sit on vast deposits. Instead, they acquired gold through trade, exchanging their emeralds, salt, and textiles with neighboring lowland peoples for raw gold and beeswax, which they then crafted into objects of breathtaking sophistication. The primary alloy they worked with was tumbega, a mixture of gold, copper, and sometimes silver that produced a distinctive pinkish-yellow glow that the Muisca associated with the light of the sun. Their goldsmithing technique, particularly a process called mise en couleur, or depletion gilding, in which the copper was chemically removed from the surface of the object to leave a pure gold exterior, was as technically advanced as anything produced in Europe at the same time. But here is the crucial thing, the thing that the Spanish entirely failed to grasp. The Muisca did not prize gold for its monetary value. In their cosmology, gold was the material representation of the sun, and the sun was the creative, divine force of the universe. In Muisca mythology, the sacred substance Naya, the gold color itself, represented the energy contained in the divine creative principle of Chimanagagua, the supreme being from whom all existence flowed. Gold was not wealth in the European sense. Gold was a medium for communicating with the sacred. Gold was what you gave away. Gold was what you offered. Gold was what you threw into a lake. Every family in Muisca society decorated their homes with gold objects, not because they were showing off their riches, but because they were maintaining their relationship with the divine. When a Muisca leader wanted to honor the gods, or mark a transition, or give thanks, or ask for protection, they made offerings of gold. Not to a temple treasury that would accumulate wealth. Not to a royal vault that would grow fatter every year. To the water. To the earth. To the places where the human world touched the world of spirits. Gold flowed out of Muisca hands and into the sacred places, and that was the point. That was entirely the point. The Muisca landscape was understood as a living, conscious entity, threaded through with sacred geography. Lakes were especially important. In Muisca cosmology, water was the domain of powerful supernatural beings and the source of life itself. The mother goddess Bishul was said to have emerged from a sacred lake, walked among human beings and populated the earth, and then returned to the water in the form of a serpent. There were several sacred lakes within Muisca territory, each associated with its own spiritual history and ritual functions. Gold, emeralds, and other objects were regularly offered at lakesides as sacrifices. The act of giving precious things to the water was not unusual. It was not extraordinary. It was simply part of how the Muisca maintained their relationship with the forces that governed existence. The Muisca religious system was presided over by specialist priests, the Jeks, who occupied a distinct social role separate from the political chiefs and who maintained the ceremonial calendar, the sacred sites, and the body of cosmological knowledge that gave Muisca life its spiritual framework. The Jeks were not aristocrats in the European sense. Their authority derived from their knowledge and their role as intermediaries with the divine, rather than from birth or land ownership. They underwent their own extended periods of training and initiation, during which they learned the cosmology, the ritual procedures, the calendrical calculations, and the healing practices that defined their role. Their presence at the major ceremonies, including the investiture ceremony at Lake Guatavita, was essential, and their knowledge was the institutional memory of the entire ceremonial tradition. The relationship between the Muisca political structure and their ceremonial life was intimate and carefully calibrated. The Zipa and the Zak derived their authority not merely from military power or economic control but from their ceremonial roles, from the fact that they were the people through whom the community maintained its relationship with the sacred. A Zipa who lost the confidence of the Jeks, or who failed to fulfill his ceremonial obligations, risked losing the cosmological legitimacy that made his political power possible. This is why the investiture ceremony at Lake Guatavita was so important. It was not simply a public celebration of a new leader's accession. It was the mechanism by which the new leader was actually made into what a leader was supposed to be, a person with divine authorization, brought into relation with the goddess of the lake, confirmed in his role by the visible act of giving himself, gold-covered and vulnerable, to the sacred water. Understanding this is absolutely essential because without it, the story of El Dorado makes no sense. Every piece of gold that ended up in a Muisca lake was not lost. It was placed, deliberately, reverently, with full intention. The Muisca were not accidentally rich. They were deliberately generous in a direction that European eyes could not follow, because that direction led downward into dark water and away from human accumulation. The Muisca Confederation was at the height of its power and complexity when, in the early 16th century, the first rumors of their wealth began to drift toward the Spanish settlements on the coast. And those rumors, filtered through multiple translations, amplified by wishful thinking, distorted by the mechanisms of colonial greed, would become the engine of one of history's most extraordinary and destructive obsessions. But before the Spanish arrived, there was a ceremony. A real ceremony at a real lake, performed by real people for real sacred reasons. And that ceremony, seen through the wrong eyes, heard through the wrong ears, understood in entirely the wrong way, would become the seed of a myth so powerful that it is still growing more than 500 years later. Lake Guatavita is not a large body of water. Standing on its rim today, most visitors are surprised by how small it is, roughly 300 meters across, a nearly perfect circle of dark green water set like a jewel in a volcanic crater in the hills northeast of Bogotá. The lake sits at just under 3,000 meters above sea level, and on most days it is wrapped in mist, the surrounding hillsides rolling away under a sky that seems lower and closer than it does at sea level, as if the clouds have come down to keep secrets. There is something otherworldly about the place even now, even after centuries of draining attempts and tourist visits and national park management. Standing there, it is not difficult to understand why the Muisca considered it sacred. The Muisca had been conducting ceremonies at Lake Guatavita for centuries before the Spanish ever heard of it. The lake was understood as the home of a powerful female deity, a goddess who lived in the depths, who required gifts and attention, and whose goodwill was essential to the prosperity of the people above. Different accounts give different names to this deity, and the specifics vary across sources, but the essential understanding was consistent. The lake was alive, it was conscious, and it was hungry for offerings. Not human sacrifice. The Muisca were not notable for human sacrifice, but gold, emeralds, precious things given willingly, offered without expectation of return. The ceremony that would become known to the Spanish and then to the entire world as the ceremony of El Dorado was the investiture ritual of the Zipa, the supreme chief of the Southern Muisca Confederation. Our most detailed written account of this ceremony comes from the Chronicle of Juan Rodriguez Fraile, a Bogotá-born colonial writer whose book El Carnero, written between 1636 and 1638, serves as one of the most important sources for the early colonial history of New Granada. Rodriguez Fraile based his account on the testimony of Don Juan, the nephew of the last indigenous lord of the Guatavita chiefdom, making it a second-hand account but one close enough to the living memory of the ceremony that historians consider it broadly reliable. According to Rodriguez Fraile's account, the ceremony began long before the lake. When a Muisca leader died and it was time to invest his successor, who was not his own son, because inheritance passed through the maternal line, but typically his nephew or his sister's son, the new chief had to undergo an extended period of preparation and purification. He was required to retreat into a cave or sacred enclosure for a period of years. During this time, 6 years according to Rodriguez Fraile's account, he was not permitted to see sunlight. He could only move about at night. He was forbidden to eat meat, salt, or chili peppers. He was forbidden any contact with women. He was, in essence, held in a kind of suspended state between his old identity and his new one, stripped of ordinary pleasures and ordinary time, made into something other than an ordinary man. He was being prepared to become a vessel for divine authority. When the period of seclusion ended and the time of investiture arrived, the new Zipa emerged into the world and was taken to Lake Guatavita. The ceremony that followed was described by Rodriguez Fraile in terms that, even centuries later on the page, retain a quality of genuine grandeur. A raft was constructed of rushes, a wooden platform in some accounts, and decorated with the finest objects the Muisca could provide. On this raft, for braziers were lit, burning fragrant resins and incense. The word used in one translation is moke, the local term for the incense of the region, and the smoke rose and drifted across the water in great clouds, blotting out the daylight in the immediate vicinity of the ceremony and creating an atmosphere of dense, aromatic unreality. The lake itself was surrounded by crowds of people. Rodriguez Fraile speaks of a ship with high sidewalls that could barely contain the mass of men and women dressed in fine feathers and golden ornaments, and the people on the shore lit their own braziers, so that the incense smoke from every direction merged into a single vast cloud above the dark water. The new chief was stripped completely naked. He was then coated with a sticky resin or fragrant liquid, and over this, finely powdered gold was applied, blown through hollow canes by attendants, according to one of the most vivid accounts, preserved in the Chronicle of Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, until his entire body gleamed from sole to crown. Not just dusted or touched with gold, but comprehensively covered in it. so that he looked less like a man and more like a living statue, a human figure cast entirely in the metal of the sun. He became, in that moment, el hombre dorado, the gilded man, the golden one. The raft was pushed out onto the water. The new chief stood at its center, shining in the thin Andean air, surrounded by his highest-ranking attendants and the 4 smoking braziers, and was carried toward the middle of the lake. On shore, the people fell silent or in some accounts began to play music. Flutes, rattles, drums, the sound drifting across the water in waves. When the raft reached the center of the lake, at the deepest point above the goddess's domain, the new chief dove into the water. The gold washed from his body and sank into the depths, a man becoming divine through the act of dissolution, and emerging from the water as what he would henceforth be. Not just a human ruler, but a ruler born from and sanctified by the sacred. The attendants on the raft simultaneously threw offerings into the water. Tunjos, the small gold figures the Muisca crafted for this purpose, as well as emeralds, pottery, and other objects of value. All of it went to the bottom of the lake. All of it was given away. Consider the symbolism from the inside, as it was intended to be understood rather than as it was observed by outsiders. The new chief arrived at the lake as himself, a man flawed and human, carrying whatever history his predecessor's death and his own years of preparation had given him. He was then covered in the substance of the sun, transformed into a living image of the divine light that governed the Muisca cosmos. In that state of radical transformation, elevated out of ordinary humanity and into something between human and divine, he was carried to the center of the sacred water, the domain of the goddess, the meeting place of the human world and the world beneath. And there, at that threshold, he gave it all away. The gold that had made him divine was returned to the water, given to the goddess, released. And he emerged from the lake as a man again, but a man changed by the encounter, sanctified, authorized, his rule legitimate not because of hereditary claim or military power alone, but because he had enacted the ceremony that connected him to the sacred geography of his people. This is a profoundly sophisticated political theology. It is not unusual across human cultures to have investiture ceremonies that consecrate a leader's authority through religious ritual. The coronation ceremonies of European monarchs were doing something structurally similar, if with different elements. What is distinctive about the Muisca ceremony is the absolute centrality of giving. The chief becomes legitimate not by receiving the symbols of power but by surrendering them. The gold that is given to the lake is not a loss. It is the confirmation. It is the act that makes everything real. Modern archaeologists have confirmed that Lake Guatavita contains genuine Muisca artifacts, including gold objects and other offerings. Archaeological surveys conducted around the lake have found material culture consistent with ritual use stretching across the late Muisca period. The Muisca raft itself, the breathtaking golden artifact discovered in 1969 by 3 farmers in a small cave near the village of Pasca, south of Bogotá, is now considered strong evidence that ceremonies of this kind actually took place. The raft, which is made of tumbaga and is 19.5 centimeters long, depicts a chief standing in the center of a flat-bottomed vessel, surrounded by attendants carrying banners, the chief himself adorned with headdresses, nose rings, and earrings. It is currently displayed at the Museo del Oro in Bogotá, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects in the world, a tiny, perfect, shining record of a moment that changed history. It is important to note that archaeologists today debate the precise nature and regularity of the Guatavita ceremony. Some scholars argue that the ceremony was performed at the investiture of each new Zipa, making it a recurring event across generations. Others suggest it may have been a less frequent, more exceptional ritual. Archaeological surveys around the lake itself have found evidence of small-scale, ongoing ritual offerings rather than the extravagant mass ceremonies described by Spanish chroniclers, suggesting that the accounts may have been somewhat amplified by the time they reached European ears. It is also worth noting that similar water offering ceremonies were documented at other Muisca sacred lakes, not only at Guatavita, which complicates the identification of Guatavita as the one and only source of the El Dorado story. What is not in doubt is this: the ceremony was real. The gold was real. The spiritual significance was real. What was not real was what the Spanish made of it. The Spanish did not hear about a sacred ceremony in which a new chief was invested with divine authority through an act of generous self-offering to a goddess in a lake. They heard about a place where a man was covered in gold. And to the Spanish ears of the 16th century that meant one thing: There was more gold. There had to be more gold. A people who could afford to pour gold into a lake must have gold in quantities beyond imagining. Somewhere close to that lake, there had to be a city, a vault, a mountain, an empire's worth of gold. All they had to do was find it. In this catastrophic misreading of a sacred ceremony, the legend of El Dorado was born. Rumors, in the 16th century, traveled with the speed of horses and the distortion of bad translation. The Spanish colonial networks that stretched along the Caribbean coast of South America in the 1520s and 1530s were simultaneously vast and gossip-ridden, places where information about inland peoples passed through multiple intermediaries, indigenous translators, runaway slaves, captured warriors, rival conquistadors, bored sailors waiting for wind, before it ever reached the ears of someone with the power to act on it. The Spanish had been on the mainland coast of northern South America since 1515, when the settlement of Cumana in Venezuela became the first permanent European outpost on the continent. By the 1530s, a loose network of coastal settlements existed from present-day Venezuela westward along the coast to what is now Colombia. The Europeans who lived in these places were not, for the most part, men of great wealth or education. They were adventurers, minor nobles, soldiers of fortune, priests, and opportunists who had come to the New World because the Old World had offered them nothing or not enough. They were simultaneously desperate and ambitious, and they were surrounded by an enormous continent about which they knew almost nothing. The gold they had already found among the lowland peoples of the coast, brought down from the highlands through long-established indigenous trade routes, told them that somewhere in the interior there was a source. But where? The lowland peoples who traded this gold were often reluctant to reveal where it came from, for complex reasons that included both practical self-interest and genuine lack of knowledge. Some of what they told the Spanish was accurate. Some was what they thought the Spanish wanted to hear. Some was a deliberate misdirection designed to send the Europeans wandering off into the wilderness and away from the things that actually mattered. One of the earliest specific references to what would become El Dorado appears in the Chronicle of Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdez, in his Historia General de las Indias, written in the 1530s. Oviedo described hearing from multiple Spanish soldiers who had passed through or visited Quito, in what is now Ecuador, accounts of a great lord or prince of the interior who covered himself with gold every morning and washed it off every evening. Oviedo's account is remarkably specific. The lord in question anointed himself with a gum or fragrant liquid onto which finely powdered gold was applied, so that he resembled from sole to crown a brilliant piece of shaped gold. The prince was said to consider this covering more beautiful and noble than any ornament of beaten or pressed gold. Among his people, this was described as a mark of supreme wealth and power, but also of supreme spiritual significance, though that second element tended to get lost in the retelling. This account is fascinating for several reasons. First, it suggests that some version of the Muisca ceremony, or perhaps a related ceremony among another people, was genuinely reaching Spanish ears as early as the mid-1530s. Second, and crucially, it already shows the mechanism of mythification at work. The spiritual logic of the ceremony, the offering, the self-dissolution in sacred water, the investiture of divine authority, has been stripped away, and what remains is only the gold-covered man. A man covered in gold, in the Spanish imagination of the 16th century, was not a man performing a sacred duty. He was a symptom, a sign, evidence of inconceivable wealth somewhere nearby. The expansion of the rumor from a golden man to a golden city happened gradually, and its progression tracked the movement of Spanish expeditions deeper into the continent. As one expedition failed to find the source of the gold and returned with stories of what they had heard from indigenous guides along the way, the next expedition set out with a slightly larger, slightly more distorted version of the story. The golden man became a golden king. The golden king became a golden kingdom. The golden kingdom eventually became a golden city. Manoa, it was called in one of its most elaborate versions, built on the shores of a vast inland lake called Lake Parim, which cartographers confidently drew on maps of the interior of South America for more than a century, even though no European had ever actually seen it and it almost certainly did not exist. This process of escalation was not simply a matter of individual dishonesty, though dishonesty certainly played a role. There were conquistadors who deliberately exaggerated what they had seen or heard in order to secure royal funding for their next expedition, or to position themselves advantageously in the cutthroat politics of colonial governance. But the myth also grew through something more fundamental, the structure of desire. When a person wants something badly enough, evidence for that thing becomes visible everywhere. Indigenous accounts that described any kind of wealth, a lord with fine ornaments, a community with skilled craftsmen, a valley where the soil was fertile, became, in the ears of gold-hungry Europeans, new evidence for El Dorado. Every piece of the puzzle was assumed to fit because the alternative, that there was no puzzle, that there was no city, that the legend was built on a misunderstanding, was psychologically intolerable. There is also a subtler mechanism worth considering. The indigenous peoples the Spanish encountered along the way were not passive recipients of European projection. Many of them actively participated in the construction of the El Dorado myth, for reasons of their own. If a Spanish expedition arrived at your village demanding gold and tribute, telling them that the gold was further east, always further, always just beyond the next range of mountains, was an extremely effective survival strategy. It sent the dangerous, violent strangers on their way. It bought time. It shifted the burden of conquest to some other community downstream. Multiple historians have noted that indigenous informants across the continent seem to have developed a shared understanding of how to redirect Spanish gold hunger away from themselves and toward a perpetually receding horizon. The story of El Dorado, then, was a collaborative fiction from almost the beginning, built by Spanish desire and indigenous strategy, elaborated by translation and distance, sustained by the economics of colonial ambition. And yet, at its foundation, buried under all the layers of fantasy, there was something real. A lake, a ceremony, a man covered in gold, giving himself to the water as an offering to a goddess. Truth so completely transformed by the machinery of myth that it became unrecognizable, and yet never quite disappeared. Before we follow the expeditions, it is worth pausing to trace, with some precision, the mechanism by which a relatively local Muisca ceremony became a continent-wide obsession. This mechanism is interesting in its own right because it tells us something about how information moves in colonial environments, how stories travel, how they change as they travel, and what happens when the structure of the receiving culture is very different from the structure of the originating one. By the mid-1530s, the Spanish colonial world of the Caribbean and northern South America had developed what we might call a rumor economy. Settlements from Panama to the islands of the Caribbean to the Venezuelan coast were connected by irregular shipping routes along which goods, people, and information moved simultaneously. The information that mattered most in this economy was information about wealth, about where gold could be found, where populations of indigenous people could be converted and taxed, where the next great conquest might be organized. This information was simultaneously the most valuable commodity in the colonial world and the least reliable, because the incentives to produce it were enormous and the mechanisms for verifying it were almost non-existent. Into this environment, accounts of the Muisca ceremony arrived in fragments, translated through multiple layers of interpretation. The indigenous informants who described the ceremony to Spanish listeners were not necessarily describing the same ceremony, and they were certainly not describing it in the same language. The Chibcha language of the Muisca was not Spanish. The coastal peoples who had heard of the ceremony through their own trade networks were not speaking Chibcha either. The Spanish who heard the accounts were working through indigenous interpreters whose competence and incentives varied enormously. And the Spaniards doing the listening were doing so through the specific cultural and theological filters of 16th-century Castilian Christianity, which meant that certain features of what they heard, the spiritual dimension, the ceremonial logic, the cosmological significance of the gold, were systematically incomprehensible to them and therefore systematically omitted from the accounts they passed on. What survived this translation process was essentially a residue, the most concrete, the most material, the most literally comprehensible elements of the ceremony. A man covered in gold, a lake, offerings thrown into the water. These fragments were both true and deeply misleading. They were true in that they described something real. They were misleading because they described a sacred ceremony in the language of treasure hunting, stripping the ceremony of the conceptual framework that gave it its actual meaning and replacing it with a framework that made it a clue rather than an act. The geographical expansion of the myth was driven partly by its own internal logic and partly by the specific geography of the colonial situation. When Quesada reached Muisca territory in 1537 and found real gold, in quantities that were impressive even if they fell short of the legend, his success both confirmed that the story was pointing toward something real and expanded the uncertainty about how much more real it might be. The Muisca themselves, when questioned under varying degrees of pressure about where their gold came from and where more could be found, often pointed further east, toward the Llanos, the great eastern plains of Colombia, and beyond them toward the vast unknown basin of the Orinoco and its tributaries. Whether this was true or strategic misdirection or the result of miscommunication or some combination of all three, is impossible to say with certainty. But the directional bias was consistent and was taken as evidence. Within a decade of the conquest of Muisca territory, Dorado had migrated east, past the Muisca heartland, into the unmapped interior of northern South America. It had also grown. The Golden Man had become a Golden King. The Golden King now ruled a Golden City. The Golden City sat on the shores of a golden lake. In each iteration, the story became simultaneously larger and more specific, more precisely located in the imagination even as it became more vague in geographical fact. By the 1550s, the city of Manoa on the shores of Lake Parim was described in some Spanish accounts with the specificity of a real city, streets laid out in a grid, temples with known architectural features, a king whose daily routine was detailed down to the hour. None of these details came from witnesses. All of them came from the compounding logic of rumor and desire. One particularly fascinating moment in the myth's development involves the connection drawn between El Dorado and the Inca Empire. After the Spanish conquest of Peru in the early 1530s, substantial numbers of Inca priests, nobles, and soldiers had fled the collapse of their civilization and moved into poorly mapped regions to the north and east. Spanish colonists were aware of this diaspora, and some speculated that the remnants of the Inca court, with their famously vast stores of gold, had retreated to a hidden location in the unexplored interior and were rebuilding their empire there. This speculation attached itself to the El Dorado myth with remarkable ease, because it provided a perfect explanation for why a city of gold might exist that no European had yet found. It was a refugee civilization, specifically hiding from the Europeans who had destroyed its predecessor. Lake Parim on its maps appeared in some accounts in positions consistent with the rumored location of this Inca remnant community. The myth was absorbing other myths, growing richer and more complex with each encounter. This process of accumulation meant that by the time major expeditions were being planned and funded in the 1540s and 1550s, El Dorado had become something more than a treasure hunt and something less than a coherent geographic hypothesis. It was a genre of colonial imagination, a space into which all the unexplained, all the promised, all the desired could be deposited without the discomfort of having to verify anything. And in that capacity, it was extraordinarily productive, not of gold but of exploration. The search for El Dorado drove European geographic knowledge of northern South America forward with a speed and coverage that purely rational survey work would never have produced, because rational survey work does not send men into jungles to die. Only the possibility of incalculable reward does that. There is another dimension to the cultural legacy of El Dorado that deserves careful attention, and it connects to the larger history of colonialism in the Americas in ways that are still being reckoned with today. The myth did not only distort European understanding of indigenous South America, it also, over time, distorted indigenous understanding of itself. The generations of indigenous peoples who survived the conquest period, who lived under Spanish colonial rule, who worked in the mines and the encomiendas, who watched their ceremonial traditions suppressed and their sacred sites desecrated in the pursuit of a golden city that had never existed, inherited a story about themselves that was not theirs. The El Dorado legend told a story about indigenous wealth that positioned that wealth as something rightfully available to European extraction, as something whose spiritual context was either irrelevant or an obstacle to be overcome. The Muisca people of today, descendants of the civilization that gave the world El Dorado, have been working for decades to reclaim their cultural heritage from the overlay of colonial mythology. One of the most consistent things contemporary Muisca voices emphasize when speaking about gold is almost precisely what their ancestors' actions demonstrated. Gold is not wealth. Gold is an offering. A spokesperson for the modern Muisca community is quoted in historical records as having said, simply and with remarkable directness, "For the Muisca of today, just as for our ancestors, gold is nothing more than an offering. Gold does not represent wealth to us." This statement, which should probably have been obvious from the ceremony at Lake Guatavita, if anyone had cared to understand the ceremony rather than project onto it, contains in a single sentence the entire corrective to 5 centuries of European misreading. The Museo del Oro in Bogotá, where the Muisca raft and thousands of other pre-Columbian gold objects are displayed, is itself a kind of reckoning with this legacy. The museum was established in 1939 by the Banco de la República de Colombia and has grown into one of the most important collections of pre-Columbian gold work in the world, housing more than 55,000 pieces from dozens of different indigenous cultures. The decision to display these objects in their cultural context, with explanatory material that emphasizes their spiritual and ceremonial significance rather than their monetary value, represents a conscious effort to tell the El Dorado story correctly, to present the gold as what it was rather than what European desire needed it to be. Lake Guatavita, now under the protection of Colombian law as a national heritage site, receives visitors who climb to its rim and look down at the cold green water with whatever they have brought to that encounter. Some come with curiosity. Some come with the residual half-belief that there really is something extraordinary down there. Some come as pilgrims of a kind, honoring the place where something extraordinary actually happened. Not the mythological event, but the real one. A ceremony in which a people express their understanding of their relationship with the sacred by doing the one thing that European civilization found completely impossible to comprehend, which was giving their most precious things away. To understand why the myth of El Dorado had the power it had, why generation after generation of men were willing to walk into the Amazon jungle and the Orinoco highlands and the Colombian mountains on the strength of a story that none of them had any solid evidence for, we need to understand who these men were. What kind of person becomes a conquistador? The Spain of the early 16th century was a country in a peculiar and volatile moment. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish rulers, had formally concluded in 1492 with the fall of Granada. The same year, Columbus sailed west. For a generation of Spanish men who had grown up in a culture defined by crusade, by holy war, by the idea that military service in the name of God and the crown was the highest possible calling, the sudden end of a centuries-old conflict left a tremendous amount of energy without an outlet. The Americans provided that outlet. The conquest of Mexico by Hernán Cortés between 1519 and 1521, and of Peru by Francisco Pizarro beginning in 1532, sent tremors of ambition and avarice through Spanish society that were felt at every level. The men who followed were not, for the most part, the noble knights of Spanish Romantic literature. Most conquistadors came from the minor nobility or from the aspirational middle classes, the group the Spanish called hidalgos, men who had the right to bear arms and who possessed a concept of personal honor without possessing the land or money that would have made that honor comfortable. They were men for whom the New World represented something that Europe had not offered them, the chance to be great. Not merely the chance to be rich, though that mattered enormously, but the chance to do something that would be remembered. To have their names attached to discoveries, to conquests, to cities, to mountains. To be the kind of men that the stories were written about. The psychology of conquistador culture was built around this hunger for honor as much as for gold. When Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada's men suffered from disease and starvation on their march up the Magdalena River in 1536, what kept them going was not only the promise of gold. They had precious little evidence of gold at many points in that journey, but the narrative they had placed themselves inside. A narrative in which they were the heroes of a great discovery, men destined to find something extraordinary. To turn back was not merely to fail economically, it was to fail existentially. It was to return home as the kind of man who gave up, which in the honor culture of 16th century Spain was a fate arguably worse than death. The Catholic Church also played a central role in the psychological infrastructure of conquest. Every expedition departed with priests, often Franciscan or Dominican friars, whose official purpose was to bring Christianity to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This gave the entire enterprise of conquest a theological justification that allowed even its most brutal episodes to be understood, by those committing the brutality, as acts of divine service. Indigenous people who resisted conversion or who refused to acknowledge Spanish sovereignty could be legally classified as enemies of God, which provided a rationale for violence that would otherwise have been difficult to sustain even by the flexible moral standards of the era. The conquistadors then were not simply criminals or opportunists. They were men who believed, with varying degrees of sincerity, that they were doing God's work, that they were civilizing the uncivilized, that the gold they seized was rightfully theirs as agents of a divinely sanctioned empire. This belief structure was not a cynical cover story. It was deeply internalized, structurally embedded in the culture from which these men came, and it made their behavior simultaneously comprehensible and catastrophic. The economics of conquest also deserve attention. Expeditions like those in search of El Dorado were not government operations in the modern sense. They were privately funded ventures, organized under a legal framework called the capitulation, a contract between the Spanish crown and a private individual, the adelantado, who agreed to finance and lead an expedition in exchange for a share of whatever was found. The crown provided legal authority and the promise of titles and future governorships. The adelantado provided the ships, the weapons, the men, and the money. If the expedition failed, as most did, the adelantado bore the loss. If it succeeded, as the conquests of Mexico and Peru spectacularly had, the rewards were incomprehensible. This structure created a specific kind of desperation. A man who had spent his family's fortune equipping an expedition could not easily turn back. Every month of failure deepened his debt and his determination to recover it. The men under his command had often signed on for a share of profits rather than wages, meaning that they too had skin in the game, a financial incentive to keep marching regardless of how bad things got. The search for El Dorado was not merely romantic adventure. It was, at its structural core, a very specific kind of financial gamble, played out in the most brutal possible terrain, by men who had run out of the option to lose. And surrounding all of this was the world that Cortés and Pizarro had made. In 1519, Cortés had arrived in Mexico and within 2 years had toppled the Aztec Empire, claiming almost incomprehensible quantities of gold, jade, feathers, and art for the Spanish crown. In 1532, Pizarro had captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca and extracted for his ransom the single largest quantity of gold and silver ever seized in a single transaction in human history. A room filled to a specific line on the wall, once with gold and twice with silver. These events had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that vast pre-Columbian civilizations with immense material wealth did exist in the Americas. They had also demonstrated that a relatively small force of armored, horseback-mounted, gunpowder-equipped Europeans could defeat armies of thousands. The precedent existed. The template was there. All that remained was to find the next one. The aftermath of Cortés's and Pizarro's conquests cascaded through Spanish society in ways that are difficult to overstate. Young men of ambition who had grown up hearing stories of the conquest of Mexico or Peru did not hear those stories as cautionary tales about the cost of violence. They heard them as proof that the world could be transformed by individual action. That a man who was nobody in Spain could become a governor, a hero, a man whose name was carved into the foundation stones of new cities, simply by being willing to march toward the impossible and not stopping when things got hard. The conquistadors who searched for El Dorado were, in many cases, men who had grown up in this aftermath. They had been formed by a cultural moment in which the impossible had happened twice already, and in which the failure to achieve the impossible was the only truly unacceptable outcome. El Dorado, to the conquistador mind, was simply the next Tenochtitlan, the next Cusco. It had to be there because the pattern demanded it. The Americas had already yielded 2 impossible discoveries. A third was not only possible but mathematically inevitable. And so men kept looking for generation after generation, each one certain that the next range of mountains or the next bend in the river would reveal what their predecessors had simply missed. The expeditions launched in search of El Dorado are among the most remarkable episodes in the history of exploration, and also among the most tragic. What follows is not a complete catalog. Dozens of expeditions were mounted over the course of a century, but a survey of the most significant, the ones whose scale, ambition, or consequences most clearly illustrate the strange power of the Golden Myth. The first European to successfully reach Muisca territory was Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, and his expedition remains one of the most underappreciated achievements, and one of the most devastating conquests, of the age of exploration. Quesada was not a soldier by training. He was a lawyer born around 1509 in Spain, who arrived in the Americas in January 1536 as part of the armada of the new governor of Santa Marta, Pedro Fernández de Lugo. Within months of arrival, he had been appointed chief magistrate and second in command for a major expedition into the interior. His lack of military experience was notable, but what he had instead was organizational intelligence, legal training, and a ferocious ambition. On April 5th or 6th of 1536, Quesada departed from the coastal city of Santa Marta with an army that numbered, depending on the source, somewhere between 800 and 900 men. This was, as historians have noted, a force larger than what Cortés brought to Mexico or Pizarro to Peru. The mission was officially to explore the Magdalena River and find an overland route to Peru, but the stories of inland gold that had been circulating for years were in everyone's minds. The expedition split into two groups, one traveling overland and one by river, and almost immediately began to fall apart. The land crossing of the Magdalena River Valley and the Opon Mountains was the nightmare that surpassed almost anything the expedition's members had been prepared to endure. The terrain was relentless and hostile in ways that European military training had no framework for. The jungle of the Magdalena lowlands was not like any landscape these men had experienced. It was hot, suffocatingly humid, and alive in ways that felt malevolent. Not because it was trying to kill them, but because it simply did not care whether they lived or died, and was indifferent enough to their passage that it very nearly killed them regardless. Tropical diseases, primarily dysentery and fever, swept through the column. Food supplies ran out faster than anticipated because the jungle did not yield the kind of forageable resources that European countryside provided. Indigenous groups along the route sometimes traded food and sometimes attacked. The river itself flooded. Men drowned. Men starved. Men were shot with poisoned arrows that killed slowly and horribly. Men simply disappeared into the landscape and were never accounted for. Of the original force of more than 800 men, only somewhere between 166 and 197 Europeans survived to reach Muisca territory in early March of 1537. A mortality rate of nearly 75%, all before a single battle had been fought with the civilization they had come to conquer. What sustained the survivors through that ordeal is difficult to fully comprehend from this distance, but the accounts suggest a combination of brutal discipline imposed by Quesada, the financial desperation of men who had committed everything to this venture, and the rumors, always the rumors, of gold. They grew more insistent the closer they came to the highlands. When Quesada's battered, disease-ridden survivors finally climbed out of the lowland jungle and entered the Muisca highlands, they found something that must have seemed almost miraculous after everything they had endured. A high, cool plateau, agricultural fields, organized settlements, a civilization, and gold, not in the quantities the legend promised, but real gold, present in temples and in the homes of chiefs, worked into sophisticated objects that confirmed every story they had ever heard. The Muisca initially received the Spanish with a mixture of curiosity and caution, and for a brief moment a kind of fragile peace existed. The Zipa Tisquasusa did not immediately attack, though he recognized the newcomers as a threat. Quesada's response to this initial restraint was a surprise attack. The Spanish launched a military assault that killed many Muisca warriors and forced Tisquasusa to flee. He was later found and killed in an ambush. The southern Muisca territories were then systematically plundered. Quesada's men extracted large quantities of gold and emeralds from the palaces and temples of Bacata. The Zac Quimilan ruler of the northern territories at Hunza, was captured without significant military resistance and his wealth was seized. A sacred sun temple at Araca was accidentally burned by two of Quesada's soldiers. By the end of 1538, the conquest of the Muisca heartland was essentially complete, and on August 6 of that year, Quesada formally founded the city of Santa Fe de Bogotá on the site of the Muisca capital. What Quesada found in Muisca territory confirmed that gold was there. But it did not confirm the existence of a city of gold, because no such city existed. What existed was a civilization that valued gold spiritually, that created exquisite objects from it, and that regularly gave it away to sacred places. The gold that Quesada's men seized was the accumulated product of that tradition. There was no hidden mine, no secret vault, no mountain of unworked ore. What there was already gone, lying at the bottom of Lake Guatavita and half a dozen other sacred lakes, given to the gods who had received it centuries before the Spanish ever arrived. At the moment of Quesada's arrival in the highlands in 1538, two other major expeditions reached the same destination simultaneously, converging on Bogotá from completely different directions. Sebastián de Belalcázar arrived from the south, having marched up from Quito in Ecuador where he had been one of Pizarro's captains. Nicolás Federman arrived from the northeast, having marched through what is now Venezuela on behalf of the German banking house of the Welsers, who had purchased the right to colonize Venezuela from the Spanish crown and had used it primarily to fund Dorado searches. These three expeditions, each having suffered tremendously to arrive at the same place at the same time, negotiated tensely for precedence, and eventually all three leaders sailed together back to Spain to argue their competing claims before the king. The story then moves south to a different kind of expedition entirely. In 1541, the Spanish governor of Quito, Gonzalo Pizarro, younger brother of the great Francisco Pizarro who had conquered the Inca, organized what was possibly the largest expedition ever launched in search of El Dorado, and possibly the one that ended in the most spectacular failure. The expedition departed Quito in February of 1541. Before they had even descended from the Andes into the lowland jungle, they were already in serious trouble. The terrain east of Quito is one of the most challenging on Earth. The transition from Andean Plateau to Amazonian Basin involves a series of steep, heavily forested ridges and deep valleys where rainfall can be measured in meters per year, where rivers run white with sediment and can rise 10 meters in a day, and where the temperature swing from highland cold to jungle heat creates its own cascade of physical distress. By the time the expedition reached the Napo River, a tributary of the Amazon, most of the indigenous auxiliaries were dead or had fled, most of the livestock was dead, and a substantial portion of the Spanish force was sick. It was at this point that Gonzalo Pizarro made a fateful decision. He had a brigantine, a small river vessel, constructed from timber cut on site, and sent it downstream under the command of his lieutenant Francisco de Orellana with a party of about 50 to 60 men. The mission was to sail downriver and find food, then return to Pizarro with supplies. Orellana was given 12 days to complete this errand. Orellana did not return. The current of the river was so strong that fighting back upstream was essentially impossible with the resources available. Orellana sent word back to Pizarro explaining this, a message that Pizarro never forgave and that Orellana's enemies would call desertion for the rest of his life, and then continued downstream. He would not stop until he reached the Atlantic Ocean 8 months later. In doing so, he became the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon River. Orellana's voyage is one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of exploration. He and his 50-odd men sailed approximately 4,700 kilometers down the world's largest river, through territory where no European had ever been and where almost no map existed, encountering one indigenous community after another, surviving ambushes, negotiating with local leaders, running through rapids, patching and repatching the aging brigantine. The expedition's chaplain, Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a chronicle of the journey that is still one of the most remarkable documents of the age of exploration. Carvajal described enormous settlements along the river's banks, populations of thousands, organized villages with sophisticated agriculture, temples, plazas, roads, that would be cited by later archaeologists investigating the existence of complex pre-Columbian Amazonian civilizations. Modern archaeology has, in fact, vindicated much of what Carvajal described, confirming that the Amazon basin harbored far more complex and densely populated societies than European scholars long believed. Carvajal also described a battle near the Trumbetish River with a group of warriors that included women fighting alongside the men, tall and robust and fierce. Orellana named the great river the Amazon in their honor, after the female warriors of Greek mythology. Whether these were actually women or whether the account was exaggerated is debated, but the name stuck, and it is because of this encounter, or this story of an encounter, that the world's largest river carries the name it does today. Meanwhile, Gonzalo Pizarro had waited in vain for Orellana's return, and eventually began the march back to Quito with his surviving men. By the time they arrived, he had fewer than 80 men left alive. He had set out with thousands. He returned barefoot, in rags, without horses, without food, without gold, without cinnamon, without anything at all except the thin satisfaction of having survived something that should have killed him. He declared Orellana a traitor and launched a formal complaint, which was ultimately resolved in Orellana's favor. Orellana himself petitioned the crown for permission to return and colonize the Amazon. He succeeded in getting funding, assembled a fleet of 4 ships, and departed Spain in 1545 with his new wife Ana de Ayala. 2 of the 4 ships were lost crossing the Atlantic. The survivors struggled up the Amazon, losing men constantly to illness and starvation. Orellana himself contracted fever and died somewhere in the lower Amazon in November of 1546, in the arms of his wife. He was approximately 35 years old. The remnants of his expedition made it to the island of Margarita off the Venezuelan coast, and the second great Amazon expedition ended as the first had, with death and failure and the river unclaimed. The Amazon. Even the name carries a weight of almost supernatural magnitude. It is not just the world's largest river by volume of water. It discharges more water into the ocean than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. It is not just vast in geographic terms. Its basin covers roughly 7 million square kilometers, an area larger than the continental United States. It is an entire world unto itself, operating by principles that are genuinely alien to anyone raised in temperate climates. And it demanded from every European who entered it in the 16th and 17th centuries a price that most of them could not afford to pay. The Europeans who pursued El Dorado into the Amazon and the Orinoco Basin were not prepared for what they found. Their military training, their religious conviction, their horses and guns and steel, all the advantages that had allowed small groups of Europeans to topple the organized armies of the Aztec and the Inca, were stripped away by the jungle with a casualness that was almost insulting. Steel rusted. Horses broke their legs in the soft terrain or drowned in river crossings or simply collapsed from heat and parasites. Gunpowder became damp and useless. Dogs, brought along as weapons and companions, died of tropical diseases or were eaten when the food ran out. The chain mail and heavy armor that had served as protection in European warfare became a source of torture in the equatorial heat, trapping sweat and breeding fungal infections and adding unbearable weight to men already weakened by dysentery. The jungle did not fight the Spanish. It simply absorbed them. The diseases that the Amazon and Orinoco Basin harbored, malaria, leishmaniasis, yellow fever, a dozen forms of parasitic infection, and simple bacterial infections that killed men who had no resistance, were invisible enemies against which no sword was useful. The insects alone, the mosquitoes, the sandflies, the botflies whose larvae burrowed under the skin, represented a constant, draining assault on bodies already pushed to the edge of endurance by physical labor and inadequate food. The rivers were treacherous in ways that coastal navigation had not prepared the Spanish for. Underwater rocks, sudden floods, unpredictable currents, whirlpools, and the logistical nightmare of trying to move hundreds of men and their equipment through a landscape that offered no roads, few clearings, and constant aggressive vegetation. And then there was the hunger. Every account of Amazonian exploration in this period returns again and again to starvation. The jungle, despite its extraordinary biological richness, is extraordinarily difficult to live off as a European forager. The skills required to find and prepare edible plants, to hunt effectively in dense forest, to navigate to productive fishing spots. These were skills that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon had spent thousands of years developing and that no European expedition carried. They assumed they could forage as they marched, as armies routinely did in Europe, where the countryside was organized around human agriculture and the forest itself was less hostile. This assumption killed thousands of them. The indigenous populations along the rivers were the expedition's only real hope for food, and the relationships the Spanish formed with these communities ranged from uneasy cooperation to violent conflict. Orellana's success, such as it was, depended significantly on his ability to establish trading relationships with communities along the Amazon, receiving food in exchange for goods and, perhaps more importantly, not being perceived as an immediate military threat. The brutal approach taken by others, raiding villages for food and enslaving inhabitants as porters and guides, typically resulted in communities retreating into the forest, burning their own food stores, and conducting guerrilla warfare against the columns from the cover of the jungle. Every hostile action by the Spanish made the next stretch of river more dangerous and less well supplied, in a feedback loop that accelerated the disintegration of expeditions already operating at the margins. The indigenous populations of the Amazon and Orinoco regions suffered enormously from the European expeditions, even the ones that did not deliberately attack them. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza, spread along trade routes and river networks much faster than the Europeans themselves traveled, so that communities the Spanish had never visited were sometimes already devastated by the time the first European faces appeared. The demographic catastrophe of the 16th century in the Americas has no precise global figure that all historians agree on, but estimates of indigenous population loss in the century following European contact range from 50 to 90% across different regions, with many specific groups being entirely eliminated. The search for El Dorado was a contributing factor to this catastrophe, though not the only one and not necessarily the largest one. For the Spanish who survived to return, and many did not, the experience of the Amazon left marks that are visible in the historical record even through the filter of official reports and optimistic accounts. Gonzalo Pizarro's return to Quito, barely clothed, barefoot, having left most of his men in the jungle, is the most dramatic example, but it was hardly unique. Expedition after expedition returned diminished to the point of being nearly unrecognizable as military forces. The men who led them often died in the attempt, or survived in physical and financial ruin, broken in ways that the official documents do not fully capture but that the human cost clearly represents. And yet the expeditions kept coming. New men with new money and new energy, and the same old story, kept organizing, kept marching, kept launching their boats into rivers that had already swallowed their predecessors. The grip of the El Dorado myth on the European imagination was not weakened by failure. If anything, each failure intensified it. The city had not been found, which meant it had not been found yet, was still out there. Every expedition that returned without reaching the goal was simply evidence that the goal was harder to reach than previously imagined, not that it did not exist. The logic of desire is not easily defeated by the facts of experience. And this is especially true when the desire in question is powerful enough, old enough, and shared by enough people to have the force of cultural conviction behind it. The Amazon River exacted a tremendous toll. The indigenous civilizations that existed along its banks in the 16th century were not the impoverished, thin-settled peoples that European colonists assumed existed in empty forest. Modern archaeology, using LiDAR scanning and other techniques, has confirmed the existence of large, sophisticated, densely populated settlements throughout the basin, including what appear to be complex urban centers, sophisticated agricultural systems, and evidence of significant interregional trade. The Spanish, in their passage through these territories, did not encounter these civilizations as civilizations. They encountered them as obstacles or as sources of food and labor. The result, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, was the near total destruction of Amazonian cultural complexity. A loss so complete that the scale of what was lost only became apparent centuries later, when archaeologists began to reconstruct it from the soil itself. By the 1580s and 1590s, the myth of El Dorado had escaped its Spanish origins and entered the European imagination more broadly. The Protestant nations of Northern Europe, England, the Netherlands, France, had their own reasons to be interested in South American gold, and those reasons were explicitly geopolitical as well as personal. Spain's American empire, financed by the silver of Potosi and the gold of the Andes, was the material basis of its military dominance of Europe. To find an alternative source of New World gold, to establish an English or Dutch foothold in the Americas before the Spanish could consolidate their hold. This was not just a matter of individual enrichment. It was a matter of national survival in the context of a Europe riven by religious and imperial conflict. Into this context stepped Sir Walter Raleigh, poet, courtier, sailor, colonial promoter, and one of the most brilliant self-mythologizers of the Elizabethan age. Raleigh had been one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites for much of the 1580s, but by the early 1590s his position at court had become precarious. He had secretly married one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting without royal permission, an act that Elizabeth I did not forgive easily, and found himself temporarily imprisoned in the Tower of London and then effectively exiled from court. He needed something spectacular to restore himself to royal favor, and El Dorado, in his mind, was that something. Raleigh had been hearing about the Golden Empire for years. The Spanish governor of Trinidad, Antonio de Berrio, had himself spent the better part of the 1580s and early 1590s conducting expeditions into the Guiana highlands in search of El Dorado, based on his reading of previous accounts and his conversations with indigenous informants. By the time Raleigh arrived in Trinidad in 1595, the story had evolved considerably from its Muisca origins. The Golden Man had long since become a golden city, and the Golden City had acquired a location. It was said to lie on the shores of an immense inland lake called Lake Parim, somewhere in the Guiana highlands between the Orinoco and Amazon rivers, in a city called Manoa. This was the version of the story that Raleigh was told by de Berrio, whom he captured and interrogated, and it was the version he chose to believe. On February 6, 1595, Raleigh departed Plymouth with 4 ships and approximately 250 men. By March 22, his fleet had reached Trinidad. He attacked the Spanish garrison at the island's colonial capital of San Jose on the evening of April 7, captured de Berrio, and established a base for the expedition upriver. On April 15, with about 100 men in several small boats, Raleigh set out up the Orinoco River into the Guiana highlands. What followed was an adventure worthy of Raleigh's considerable gifts as a storyteller, though it fell well short of the golden city that justified it. The Orinoco was in flood season, making navigation difficult and the rivers he needed to explore largely inaccessible. He and his men pushed about 400 miles into the interior, a remarkable distance given the conditions and the time frame, before turning back. He found no golden city. He found no lake of immeasurable size. He found a beautiful and complex landscape inhabited by indigenous peoples who told him what he wanted to hear and pointed further east and south, toward a horizon they knew he would never reach. What Raleigh brought back was a book. Published in 1596 under the magnificent title The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guiana, with a relation of the great and golden city of Manoa, which the Spaniards call El Dorado, it remains one of the great pieces of Elizabethan prose, vivid, atmospheric, utterly convincing in its description of real landscapes and real encounters, and highly misleading in its confident assertions about the existence of a golden city that Raleigh had entirely failed to find. He described the land of Guiana in terms designed to make Elizabeth's mouth water and her treasury open. More gold than Peru, more cities than Mexico, a land still untouched by conquest, a golden empire waiting for an English queen. The book became enormously popular not only in England but in France and the Netherlands. It was translated multiple times. It placed the city of El Dorado, Manoa, on the shores of a fictional Lake Parim in the Guiana Highlands, and this placement was accepted by cartographers across Europe, who began including Lake Parim on their maps of South America as if it were established geographic fact. Raleigh's return to England was received with considerable skepticism by those who noted that he had brought back no gold, no evidence of a golden city, and only a handful of samples that a London alderman examined and declared worthless. His enemies accused him of hiding the gold in Devon and Cornwall, of fabricating the entire account, of having spent his time at sea rather than in the interior. Raleigh was furious and defended himself vigorously, but the practical result was that he did not immediately regain royal favor, and the Second Guiana expedition was not immediately funded. He returned to Guiana in 1617, more than 20 years later, this time under King James I, who had released him from a 13-year imprisonment in the Tower on the condition that he bring back actual gold from a mine whose existence Raleigh had reported during his 1595 expedition. The terms were brutal. Raleigh was operating under a suspended death sentence for treason, and James I had made an alliance with Spain, which meant that Raleigh was explicitly forbidden to attack any Spanish settlements or vessels. If his men engaged the Spanish, James had both the diplomatic incentive and the legal mechanism to have Raleigh executed. Raleigh's expedition to Guiana in 1617 ended in complete disaster. His health had been badly damaged by his years in the Tower. He fell ill almost immediately after arriving in the New World and was unable to lead the inland expedition himself. He sent his lieutenant Lawrence Keymis with a party up the Orinoco to find the supposed gold mine. Keymis instead attacked the Spanish settlement of Santo Tomé, directly violating James's explicit orders. In the fighting, Raleigh's own son Walter was killed, shot by a musket ball. The mine was not found. Keymis returned to Raleigh's ship and, faced with the catastrophic outcome of his actions, locked himself in his cabin and killed himself. Raleigh sailed home with nothing to show for the expedition. He arrived in England to find that James I, under Spanish diplomatic pressure, was prepared to honor the old treason conviction. Walter Raleigh was executed on October 29, 1618, at the Palace of Westminster. He was approximately 66 years old. On the scaffold, according to multiple accounts, he was calm, even wry. He reportedly examined the executioner's axe and remarked that it was a sharp medicine but a sound cure for all diseases. Whether the exact words are accurate is uncertain, but the spirit of them, a man facing death with the cultivated composure of someone who has lived by the performance of courage, is consistent with everything we know about Raleigh's character. El Dorado had claimed another life, not through jungle fever or starvation or poisoned arrows, but through the political consequences of an obsession that had never been satisfied and never could be. While romantics searched the Orinoco and the Amazon for a city of gold, more practical minds turned back to the beginning of the story, Lake Guatavita. If the legend was real, if there truly had been centuries of gold thrown into this lake in offering after offering, then the gold had to be somewhere. It was at the bottom of the lake. The obvious solution, therefore, was to empty the lake. This thinking was not unreasonable. The gold was real. The ritual was real. The lake was real. And lake drainage, while technically challenging, was not beyond the capabilities of 16th century engineering. What was perhaps not fully appreciated was just how deep the lake was, how fine the sediment at the bottom, and how completely the mud would defeat every technological solution applied to it. The first attempt to drain Lake Guatavita was made in 1545 by Lázaro Font and Hernán Pérez de Quesada, the brother of the original conquistador Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, who organized a human bucket chain of indigenous laborers using clay pots and gourds. They worked through the dry season for approximately 3 months. After all that labor, they managed to lower the water level by about 3 meters. From the newly exposed edges of the lake bed, they recovered gold objects valued at roughly 3,000 to 4,000 pesos. A real find, but far short of the incalculable riches that legend promised. The excavation was then suspended, not because it seemed hopeless, but because the expense of maintaining the labor force was consuming the profits. The most significant pre-colonial drainage attempt was made in the 1580s by Antonio de Sepúlveda, a wealthy merchant of Santa Fe de Bogotá who committed substantial personal funds to the project. Sepúlveda's approach was more ambitious than the bucket chain method. He mobilized approximately 8,000 indigenous workers, the sources vary between 5,000 and 8,000, and had them cut a great notch in the crater rim of the lake, creating a channel through which the water could drain by gravity. The engineering worked. The water level dropped by approximately 20 meters, exposing a wide ring of lake bed around the central pool. From this exposed area, Sepúlveda's workers recovered gold ornaments, emeralds, pottery, and other objects, roughly 12,000 pesos worth, according to the best contemporary estimates, with some accounts mentioning an emerald as large as a man's fist. A portion of these finds was sent to King Philip II of Spain. But the project's success was temporary and catastrophic. The walls of the cut notch collapsed without warning, killing many of the workers. The lake refilled. Sepúlveda attempted further drainage efforts but never recovered either his investment or the gold he was convinced lay deeper. He died a poor man and was buried in the church at the small town of Guatavita. One of his contemporaries wrote of him with a brevity that captures the entire El Dorado story in miniature. He had recovered from the part of the lake he managed to drain more than 12,000 pesos, and then had died poor and tired, still dreaming of what lay beneath the part he could not drain. Interest in the lake never entirely faded. In the early 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt, the great Prussian naturalist and one of the most celebrated scientists of his age, visited Guatavita in 1801 during his epic 5-year exploration of the Americas. Humboldt was, by any measure, a more rigorous and skeptical observer than the conquistadors who had preceded him. And yet he performed a calculation that illustrates how powerfully the El Dorado myth could distort even careful thinking. Using Sepúlveda's reported recovery as a baseline, Humboldt estimated that if 1,000 Muisca pilgrims had visited the lake each year for 100 years, each throwing 5 gold objects into the water, the total accumulation would amount to something in the range of 500 million francs worth of gold. This number, published by a man of humbled scientific authority, was taken as serious evidence of the lake's potential, and it circulated in travel guides and adventure literature for decades, drawing a new generation of treasure hunters. The most technologically ambitious attempt to drain Lake Guatavita came at the very end of the 19th century, when a British entrepreneur named Hartley Knowles formed a company called the Company for the Exploitation of the Lagoon of Guatavita, a name of almost poetic honesty, later contracted to Contractors Limited. Knowles arrived at the lake in 1898 with mule trains carrying the pride of contemporary British technology, a large steam pump and the engineering expertise to dig a substantial tunnel. Over the next several years, his company cut a 400-meter tunnel that opened at the center of the lake bed. The tunnel worked. By approximately 1904, the lake water had been successfully drained to a depth of roughly 4 feet of mud. And this is where the story achieved its perfect and almost comic conclusion. The mud, the accumulated sediment of the lake floor, undisturbed for centuries, turned out to be an almost infinite layer of fine, dense silt. When exposed to the air and the Indian sun, it baked within hours to the consistency of cement, too hard to dig with shovels, but containing gold objects so delicate and so embedded in the hardened mass that breaking it apart destroyed what it contained. Contractors Limited recovered gold artifacts valued at approximately 500 British pounds before the dried mud blocked the drainage tunnel and the lake began to refill. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1929. The artifacts recovered were auctioned at Sotheby's in London, with some pieces eventually donated to the British Museum. In 1965, The Colombian government declared Lake Guatavita a national heritage site and protected area. Any further attempts to drain the lake or extract its contents were made illegal. The gold that remains there, and estimates of what lies beneath vary enormously, from modest to astronomical, will stay. The Muisca offering, made in a spirit of sacred generosity, will remain given to the water. What the successive draining attempts actually confirmed, beyond all the frustration and death and wasted fortune, was something the Muisca could have told anyone who asked. The gold was real, and it was there, and it was not for taking. The lake offered up just enough, a few thousand pesos here, 12,000 there, 500 pounds at the end, to demonstrate that the ritual had genuinely taken place, that the offerings had genuinely been made, and that centuries of devotion were indeed resting in the silt. But the quantity, even combined across all the attempts, was a tiny fraction of what the legend promised. The real treasure of Lake Guatavita was never the gold. It was the ceremony that put it there. The legend of El Dorado was not only a story that sent men into the jungle. It was a story that colonized the European imagination, and in doing so, it left traces in unexpected places. In the philosophical literature of the Enlightenment, in the cartographic tradition of European mapmakers, in the poetry of Victorian England, and in the cultural languages of modernity that we still speak today. The cartographic tradition is perhaps the most concrete and measurable expression of the myth's grip on European consciousness. For more than a century, from roughly the 1580s through the 1680s, Lake Parim, the imaginary inland sea on whose shores the city of Manoa was supposed to lie, appeared on European maps of South America with a consistency and confidence that suggests genuine institutional belief rather than individual wishful thinking. The most famous of these maps was produced by the Dutch cartographer Hessel Gerrits in 1625, and it shows Lake Parim as a feature comparable in size to the Caspian Sea, situated in what is now the border region between Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. The lake is large, geometrically rendered, labeled with a seriousness that suggests geographic certainty rather than hypothetical speculation. El Dorado, Manoa, is marked at its western end. These maps were not produced carelessly. Cartographers of the 17th century were, by the standards of their time, serious professionals operating within an institution that valued accuracy and completeness. They included Lake Parim not because they were naive but because the testimony they were working from, the accounts of Raleigh, of Lawrence Quimez, who reported finding evidence of a great lake further inland, of Spanish and Dutch explorers whose reports circulated through the colonial information networks, was consistent enough to seem credible. They were doing what scientists do with incomplete data, constructing the most plausible model from available evidence. The model happened to be wrong, but the process was not irrational. It was not until the early 19th century that Lake Parim was definitively removed from the map. The instrument of its removal was Alexander von Humboldt, who during his 1799 to 1804 expedition systematically surveyed the Orinoco Basin and the Guiana Highlands with a kind of rigorous measurement and record-keeping that made his conclusions impossible to dismiss. Humboldt established that no lake of the described scale existed in the surveyed region, and offered a possible explanation for why it had been reported. The seasonal flooding of the Rupununi savanna in what is now Guyana might, at certain times of year, create a temporary body of water of considerable size that could easily be mistaken for a permanent lake by observers who saw it at the wrong time of year. The permanent Lake Parim of the maps was almost certainly the Rupununi flood at its peak, glimpsed by indigenous informants who described it to European explorers using whatever geographic framework the Europeans could understand. While European cartographers were mapping an imaginary lake, European writers were doing something subtler and more enduring with the El Dorado story. The most famous and philosophically resonant use of the legend is Voltaire's Candide, published in 1759. In the 18th century, El Dorado had so thoroughly detached itself from its specific Muisca origins that it had become available as a universal philosophical symbol, and Voltaire used it with characteristic precision and irony. In chapters 17 and 18 of Candide, the naive protagonist and his companion Cacambo stumble into El Dorado, a geographically isolated, perfected, utopian society where gold is as common as dirt, where there are no priests and no prisons, where the king laughs genuinely and treats strangers as equals, where science is celebrated and poverty does not exist. This El Dorado is, explicitly, the best society that exists, the only truly good society in the novel's relentlessly dark tour of human cruelty and stupidity. and yet Candide chooses to leave it. He and Cacambo decide to take as many of El Dorado's pebbles, their gold and jewels, as they can carry, return to the outside world, and purchase their way to happiness with this fabulous wealth. The king of El Dorado, understanding exactly what this means, helps them escape with bemused generosity and a mild suggestion that staying might be wiser. Candide does not stay. He cannot. The outside world, with its corruption, its suffering, its need for status and comparison and the validation of others, pulls him away from paradise back into misery. Voltaire's El Dorado is a devastating philosophical argument disguised as adventure. The utopian society is real. It exists. It is, by every rational measure, infinitely better than anything in the European world Candide has been traveling through. And yet the hero is constitutionally incapable of remaining in it, because his formation by European society, his need for wealthy status, his need for comparison, his restlessness, his deep emotional entanglement with things and people outside El Dorado's borders, makes paradise unlivable for him. Voltaire is arguing through this episode that the reason humanity does not live in just and beautiful societies is not that such societies are impossible in principle. It is that we are unable to stop wanting the things that prevent them. We leave El Dorado. We always leave El Dorado. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to get back to a version of it that can coexist with everything we refuse to give up. Voltaire drew his El Dorado directly from Sir Walter Raleigh's account, which he had read carefully. The king of El Dorado's explanation that the European nations have been kept out by inaccessible mountains, and that this has preserved his people's innocence, echoes Raleigh's own descriptions of the geographical isolation of the Guiana highlands. Voltaire was not simply using El Dorado as convenient exotic backdrop. He was engaging with it as a piece of historical and cultural evidence, using the specific myth to say something specific about the dynamics of European civilization and its relationship to the idea of a better world. The tradition that Voltaire drew on and extended, El Dorado as utopia, as the place we imagine but never reach, as the perfect society that exists exactly as long as we are not there to ruin it, runs through European and later global literature in ways that are too numerous to catalog completely. But some highlights are worth noting. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem called El Dorado in 1849, the year of the California gold rush, in which a knight quests all his life for El Dorado and dies asking a shadow pilgrim where it lies. The shadow answers, "Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride if you seek for El Dorado." It is possible to read this as encouragement. It is equally possible, and perhaps more consistent with Poe's sensibility, to read it as a gentle, devastating announcement that the quest will never end because the destination does not exist. The knight rides boldly forever. The shadow offers directions to nowhere. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in his masterwork 100 Years of Solitude, uses the mythic resonance of El Dorado as background architecture for his exploration of the cyclical, self-consuming nature of Macondo, a community founded on isolation and golden dreams, gradually overwhelmed by its own mythologies. The relationship between Garcia Marquez's novel and the El Dorado tradition is not often made explicit, but it is pervasive. The sense that South America has been living under the shadow of a European projection that transformed its sacred spaces into repositories of imaginary European wealth, and that this transformation left a spiritual and cultural wound that has never entirely healed. The language of El Dorado has also seeped into everyday speech in ways that most people never register as mythological. To call something an El Dorado, to say, for instance, that Silicon Valley is the El Dorado of the technology industry, or that some small town has found its El Dorado in tourism, is to invoke, without knowing it, the entire 500-year history of a Muisca ritual misread and multiplied into a global symbol of unattainable desire. The word has become metaphor, and in becoming metaphor, it has become ubiquitous, which is perhaps the most unexpected legacy of all for a ceremony performed on a cold lake in the Colombian Andes by a people trying to talk to their gods. The question that lingers after all the expeditions and all the deaths and all the wasted centuries is simple: why? Why did the El Dorado myth persist with such extraordinary durability? Why did each generation of Europeans produce new versions of the same obsession, even when the evidence of failure was overwhelming? Why, for that matter, does the myth continue to resonate today, when no serious person believes in a literal city of gold somewhere in the Amazon basin? The persistence of the El Dorado myth can be understood through several overlapping frameworks, none of which tells the whole story alone. The first is economic and systemic. The structure of colonial enterprise in the 16th and 17th centuries created powerful institutional incentives to keep the myth alive. The Spanish crown had an interest in sending ambitious and potentially troublesome conquistadors away from the settled colonies and into the uncharted interior, where they might die usefully or return with useful geographic information even if they found no gold. The colonial administration of New Granada explicitly used El Dorado as a tool for managing restless veterans of the conquest period, men with weapons and experience who had no legitimate place in a settled colonial economy. Sending them east in search of El Dorado solved a social problem and occasionally produced genuine geographic discovery, even if it never produced the Golden City. The myth was therefore not merely believed. It was also weaponized, used by those in power to channel dangerous energy away from the centers of colonial authority and into the wilderness. The second framework is cultural and theological. The European tradition from which the conquistadors emerged was saturated with stories of earthly paradise and hidden kingdoms of unimaginable wealth. The Isles of the Blessed of Greek mythology, the Kingdom of Prester John of medieval legend, the Seven Cities of Cibola, the Isle of California, these were part of a long Western tradition of imagining a perfect, wealthy, just society somewhere beyond the known world, accessible in principle but hidden in practice. El Dorado slotted easily into this tradition, activating pre-existing narrative templates that gave the story an authority and a resonance that pure gold-seeking would not have provided. It was not just a treasure hunt. It was a quest. And quests, in the European tradition, had moral and spiritual significance that mere treasure hunts did not. The third framework is psychological and perhaps the most interesting. El Dorado persists because it is a story about desire itself, about the way desire works, about what desire does to us when it is powerful enough and long enough sustained. Every expedition that failed to find El Dorado could be explained, within the logic of the myth, as a failure of execution rather than a failure of the premise. The city was real. You just didn't quite make it. You ran out of time or provisions or men or luck or the right indigenous guide. Next time, the next expedition would succeed. The logic of El Dorado is the logic of the gambler who has lost 20 consecutive bets. The very scale of the losing streak is paradoxically evidence that a win must be coming. This is not a peculiarity of 16th century combination. It is a deeply human response to the possibility of transformative reward. We are, as a species, extraordinarily susceptible to the proposition that something extraordinary might be just over the next horizon. This susceptibility is not irrational. It is, in fact, one of the cognitive traits that has allowed human beings to survive and expand into every possible environment on Earth. The willingness to invest enormous effort in pursuit of something not yet proven is what builds civilizations. But it also, under certain conditions, sends armies into jungles to die for a story. The El Dorado myth also draws its persistence from something more uncomfortable: the specific way it functions as a mirror for European, and by extension Western, civilization's relationship with the non-European world. El Dorado was, from the beginning, a European projection onto a non-European reality. The Muisca ceremony at Lake Guatavito was real. What the Spanish made of it was a fantasy. But the fantasy was not random. It was shaped by what the Spanish needed to believe: that the Americas contained vast treasures that rightfully belonged to those who could seize them, that indigenous ceremonial life was meaningful only insofar as it pointed toward European valued resources, that the rich spiritual relationship the Muisca had with gold was simply evidence that more gold existed to be found. El Dorado is, in this reading, not just a myth about greed. It is a myth about the mechanism by which colonial desire transforms everything it touches into a resource. Even a ritual of sacred generosity becomes, in colonial eyes, a symptom of hidden hoarding. The devastation this transformation caused to the Muisca and to the other indigenous peoples of the region is not a side effect of the myth. It is its central consequence. The Muisca civilization was not destroyed because the Spanish were unusually cruel, though some of them were. It was destroyed because the colonial system that the myth served was premised on the extraction of resources from territories and peoples who were not defined as fully human in the eyes of the extractors. The gold at the bottom of Lake Guatavita, given to a goddess as an act of sacred generosity, became, in European translation, evidence of a civilization that existed to be plundered. And plundered it was extensively, repeatedly, and with the full institutional support of the most powerful empire in the world at that moment in time. What the El Dorado story ultimately shows us is the gap between what a thing is and what desire makes it into. Lake Guatavita is a small, beautiful lake in the Colombian highlands, sacred to the people who have lived near it for millennia, containing genuine archaeological material that testifies to centuries of sincere spiritual practice. El Dorado is an empire of gold, a city beyond the mountains, a perfect society accessible only to those who deserve it, an ultimate treasure that always retreats one step ahead of the searching hand. Both exist. They are related. But they are not the same thing, and the distance between them is exactly the distance that desire creates between reality and the dream it prefers. This is why El Dorado does not die. It cannot die as long as that distance exists. And that distance will always exist, because human desire is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be lived with. The Spanish conquistadors who marched into the jungle in search of a golden city were not uniquely deluded or uniquely greedy. They were human beings who had been given a story about where transcendence could be found, and who believed it with the intensity that life on the margins of everything tends to produce. The cartographers who drew Lake Parim on their maps were not incompetent. They were doing their best with the information they had, in a world where imagining a perfect hidden place somewhere beyond the edge of the known had deep cultural authorization. Voltaire, writing his satirical Utopia, knew exactly what he was doing, using the myth as a precision instrument to say something true about human nature that could not be said quite as precisely any other way. El Dorado lives, today, wherever the next transcendent possibility is located just beyond our reach. It lives in the startup culture that promises a technological breakthrough that will solve everything. It lives in the wellness industry that sells the idea of a body and a life that would be perfect if only we tried one more thing. It lives in every utopian political project that locates the just society not here, not now, but just over the next ridge of history, after the next revolution, after the next discovery. El Dorado is the shape that human hope takes when it detaches from the immediate world and fixes itself to a horizon. It is the dream of the perfect, the final, the complete. The thing that will satisfy all desire by finally giving desire what it wants. The Muisca knew something that the Spanish did not. Gold is not treasure. Gold is an offering. The thing of value is the act of giving it away. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita was not about accumulation. It was about release. The new chief dove into the water and emerged without his gilding, transformed not by acquiring the gold but by surrendering it. And for all the centuries that Europeans have been looking at that ceremony through the wrong end of the telescope, the lake has been keeping its counsel. Cold, circular, perfectly patient, it holds the gold in the dark exactly as it was intended. Not lost, not hidden, not waiting to be found, given. And therefore, in the deepest sense, free. No figure in the El Dorado story illustrates the myth's consuming power more completely than Antonio de Berrio, the Spanish soldier and administrator whose life became, in its final decades, essentially indistinguishable from his search for the Golden City. Berrio is not as famous as Quesada or Orlando or Raleigh, but in some ways he is the most complete embodiment of what El Dorado could do to a human life. Berrio was born around 1527 in Spain and spent the first part of his life as a competent, respected military officer, serving in campaigns in Italy, Germany, and North Africa. He came to the Americas relatively late, around 1580, when he was already past 50 years old and had inherited rights to explore the territory of New Granada from his father-in-law, the conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, who had been the first European to reach the Muisca heartland and who had spent his own final expedition in 1569 to 1573 searching futilely for El Dorado in the eastern Llanos. Berrio inherited not only the legal right to explore but the obsession itself, as if it were a family legacy to be honored. From the early 1580s onward, Berrio organized and led 3 major expeditions into the Guiana Highlands, each one probing further east and south than the last, each one bringing him no closer to Manoa but filling him with an ever more intense conviction that it existed. His contemporaries described him as a man entirely possessed by the quest, willing to spend his own fortune and his family's fortune, willing to watch his men die of fever and starvation, willing to fight the wilderness with a stubbornness that was, depending on the observer, either heroic or insane. He reached the Orinoco. He navigated its tributaries. He collected accounts from indigenous peoples along the route that confirmed, in his reading, that the city lay just a little further into the interior. It always lay just a little further. By the time Walter Raleigh arrived in Trinidad in 1595, Berrio was approximately 68 years old. He had been searching for El Dorado for more than a decade. He had lost men, money, health, and much of the practical capacity for forward movement that a younger man would have taken for granted. Raleigh captured him at San Jose and spent considerable time interrogating him about what he knew and what he believed. Raleigh described Berrio in his account as a man of great spirit and experience, a serious and capable officer who had genuinely come to believe in the reality of what he was searching for. Raleigh also noted that Berrio did everything in his power to discourage the Englishman from continuing, whether out of genuine concern for Raleigh's safety, or out of the territorial instinct of a man who has invested everything in a claim and does not want competition, is something the historical record cannot resolve. Berrio was released by Raleigh after a period of captivity and continued his efforts. He sent subordinates to organize expeditions while he himself remained at Trinidad in deteriorating health. He died in 1597 in Trinidad, having never found El Dorado. He was approximately 70 years old. He had spent roughly the last 17 years of his life in the pursuit of a city that did not exist, and there is no evidence that he ever doubted its existence. The documentation he left behind treats Manoa as a place as real as Madrid, requiring only better maps and better luck to reach. Berrio's story illuminates something that the more famous figures in the El Dorado narrative can obscure. The myth did not primarily attract reckless young adventurers. It attracted serious people, competent people, people with genuine experience of the world and of human affairs, who had survived real dangers and accomplished real things. Quesada had been a successful lawyer and an effective military commander. Raleigh was one of the most cultivated men in Elizabethan England. Berrio was a veteran officer with decades of genuine military achievement behind him. These were not naive dreamers. They were people capable of critical assessment, who had assessed the available evidence and concluded, on their terms, that the conclusion was warranted. This makes the myth more interesting, not less. The failure of El Dorado was not the failure of gullibility or stupidity. It was the failure of desire structured in a particular way, desire that was comprehensive enough and supported by enough circumstantial evidence, and embedded in enough social and institutional validation, that very capable people genuinely could not see past it. Understanding that is more useful than simply dismissing the searchers as fools. The conditions that produced the El Dorado obsession have not disappeared from human history. They have only changed their form. 500 years. That is how long the search has lasted, in various forms and with various intensities, from the first Spanish expeditions of the 1530s to the last draining attempts of the early 20th century to the occasional modern treasure hunters who still peer at satellite images of the Amazonian basin or test the silt of Colombian lakes with ground-penetrating radar. 500 years of men and women, rich and poor, sane and otherwise, drawing their fingers toward a point on a map and saying, "There. Must be there." And in a strange way they have not been entirely wrong. El Dorado was there. It still is. It is in the Museo del Oro in Bogotá, where the Muisca raft sits in a darkened case and shines with a light that is not the light of wealth but the light of a civilization that knew how to make gold speak the language of the sacred. It is in the near-perfect circle of Lake Guatavita, rising and falling with the seasons, carrying in its depths the accumulated devotion of a people who understood that the most important thing about a precious object is what you choose to do with it. It is in the stories, from Juan Rodriguez Fraile to Voltaire to Garcia Marquez to the 1,000 other writers and artists and thinkers who have used the myth to say something true about desire and loss and the gap between what we dream and what we find when we stop running and look at where we are standing. The legend of El Dorado is the legend of humanity's relationship with the unattainable, with the thing that is always somewhere else, always just beyond the capacity of the present moment to deliver. Understanding this does not diminish the story. If anything, it deepens it. Because the truth at the heart of El Dorado is not that the city is real, waiting in the jungle for the right expedition to find it. The truth is that the ceremony was real. The gold was real. The lake was real. The offering was real. And all of it, every piece of gold given to the water, every moment of genuine devotion in that cold Andean air, was done not to accumulate but to release, not to hoard but to give, not to build an empire of gold but to maintain a relationship with the sacred. The most extraordinary fact about the El Dorado story is not how many people believed in the city of gold. It is how completely they failed to understand what was actually in front of them. The Muisca did not hide their gold. They demonstrated, repeatedly and publicly, exactly what they did with it. They gave it to the lake. Every account the Spanish ever collected, from the earliest rumors to the later chronicles, confirmed this. The gold went into the water. It was a ceremony. It was an offering. And the Spanish looked at this and thought, ah, so there must be more gold somewhere else. The comprehensiveness of this misreading is almost admirable. To see an act of sacred generosity and read it as evidence of hidden treasure requires a very specific kind of determined incomprehension, the kind that desire produces when it is powerful enough to override observation entirely. This is the deepest lesson of the El Dorado story, and it is one that extends far beyond the 16th century. Desire of sufficient intensity does not distort perception. It replaces it. The conquistadors did not look at the Muisca ceremony and see it incorrectly. They did not see it at all. They saw instead what they needed to see, a symptom of wealth, a clue, an arrow pointing towards something that would satisfy the hunger they had brought with them across the Atlantic. The ceremony was present, real, available for observation. The observers were not. Their minds were elsewhere, already in the Golden City, already counting the treasure, already composing the letter to the king that would describe the greatest discovery in history. That is what desire does. That is what the myth of El Dorado, in all its versions in all its centuries, ultimately documents. Not the greed of the conquistadors specifically, not the brutality of the colonial system specifically, not even the particular mechanism by which a Muisca ritual became a European fantasy. Though all of these are part of the story. What it documents, in its fullest and most honest form, is the way human consciousness is capable of constructing an entire world from a story and then entering that world so completely that the actual world, the one that is genuinely there, becomes invisible. The Muisca knew something that the Spanish did not. Gold is not treasure. Gold is an offering. The thing of value is the act of giving it away. The ceremony at Lake Guatavita was not about accumulation. It was about release. The new chief dove into the water and emerged without his gilding, transformed not by acquiring the gold but by surrendering it. And for all the centuries that Europeans have been looking at that ceremony through the wrong end of the telescope, the lake has been keeping its counsel. Cold, circular, perfectly patient, it holds the gold in the dark exactly as it was intended. Not lost, not hidden, not waiting to be found, given, and therefore, in the deepest sense, free. The El Dorado story ends as all the best stories do, not with a discovery but with a question. The question is not where the Golden City is. The question is what we are looking for when we look for it. What is the thing we believe would satisfy us, finally and completely, if only we could find it? What is the Golden City that each of us carries, somewhere in the architecture of our desire, shining just out of reach? And when we have named it, honestly, without the comfortable vagueness that desire prefers, are we brave enough to ask whether the thing we want exists at all, or whether we have been all along standing beside a lake, mistaking a ceremony of giving for a clue to taking? That is the question Lake Guatavita has been asking for 500 years. The water is still there. The question is still open. The story of El Dorado, when told honestly and completely, is not primarily a story about gold. It is a story about the mechanism of human longing, about the way a real thing, seen through the lens of desire, becomes something that it is not, and about what that transformation costs. It cost the Muisca their civilization, their sacred sites, their independence, and enormous numbers of their people. It cost the conquistadors who pursued it, generation after generation, their lives, their fortunes, and in many cases their sanity. It cost the Amazon and the Orinoco Basin, their indigenous civilizations, their ecological relationships, their extraordinary human complexity, centuries of violence and misunderstanding. And what it produced in return was a map with a non-existent lake on it, a philosophical episode in a French satire, and a word in every major world language that means the unattainable perfect thing that you are looking for. That is not nothing. The word matters. The satire matters. Even the non-existent lake matters as evidence of how powerfully a story can shape the way human beings see, or refuse to see, the world in front of them. But it is a strange and melancholy accounting, and it suggests that the most important question the El Dorado story poses is not historical. It is ethical. What do we owe the real things in the world, the actual ceremonies, the actual lakes, the actual peoples, when our desire for something imaginary renders them invisible to us? If this story stayed with you, if it gave you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. There are more stories like this one, Histories that go deep, that reach into forgotten places and pull out something that still matters now. New episodes are released regularly, and every one is chosen because it deserves to be heard. Thank you for listening.